I had one woman come up to me in a bookstore and say, "You know, everyone told me this was a horror book, but when I finished it, I realized it was a love story." And she was absolutely right. Mark Z. Danielewski?
The Conjuring Verse is a movie franchise consisting of the Conjuring trilogy and a number of spin-offs. The main Conjuring trilogy follows Ed and Lorraine Warren, who were paranormal investigators and demonologists who were active during the 70s and 80s. Ever heard of the Amityville Horror or The Haunting in Connecticut? Yeah, that was them. In 2014, James Wan produced Annabelle, which was a spin-off of The Conjuring, inspired by the real-life events of the doll that Ed and Lorraine Warren dealt with. Annabelle received 2 more films, which are widely regarded to be much better than the original, and that leaves 2 other spin-offs. The Nun, which is an origin story for Valak, the main antagonist from Conjuring 2, and The Curse of La Llorona, which is very loosely tied into the canon and was very poorly received by critics. One of the producers, Peter Safran, has confirmed there are more films that are planned for the Conjuring Verse, specifically The Crooked Man, which will be a spin-off of The Conjuring 2, and a sequel to The Nun, but there hasn't been much confirmation past this very tacit endorsement of these properties. That being said, given the commercial success of The Conjuring Verse, which is estimated to be about $2 billion, this would make it the second highest grossing horror movie franchise after fucking Godzilla. It's safe to say this probably won't be the last we see of the Conjuring Verse. All that being said, it raises the question, why is the Conjuring Verse so popular? What was about the film or the audience that made it such tender kindling for the blazing media bonfire we have today? Growing up, I was always fed the narrative that 2000s horror movies were not as good as any other decade. And this really confused me, since some of my favorite movies, like The Exorcism of Emily Rose, Saw 2, and Jennifer's Body are from this period. And so I did some deep diving into the era, and through my research I found 4 common trends. For me to discuss the 2000s is weirdly enough to discuss the 70s, since there is so much influence between the two. Blair Witch Project takes inspiration from Cannibal Holocaust, a 70s cannibal boom film with a Dogma 95 ethos. Directors like Eli Roth, Rob Zombie, and Quentin Tarantino are heavily inspired from this period, and many of their films attempt to be send-ups of the niche genres of the time. The 70s have a lot of really amazing films, but it's hard not to recognize Last House on the Left, Cannibal Holocaust, or Salo for their intense sadism. History repeats itself, and the video nasties of yesteryear are the torture porn of today. As it turns out, not everybody likes splatter. Not everyone is comfortable with explicit violence and gore. So fans that wanted to shy away from extreme violence were left in the clutch. Especially when the other genre darling of the 2000s, found footage, was a mixed bag of both quality and body parts. It's also important to note that many of the trends of the 2000s were led by independent studios and directors. The main horror franchises that were available at the time, like Final Destination, Saw, and Child's Play, either were part of that splatter craze or really campy slashers. Speaking of slashers, studios tried beating that dead horse by remaking and rebooting the series in the intense splatter style of the era. Many were received by critical failure. To further drag the genre down, video rental stores, just like modern streaming services, needed to have the appearance of fully stocked shelves. So many B-movie and mockbuster companies supplied empty shelves with poorly made rip-offs and terrible original films. Too long didn't read. The 2000s were filled with violent niche genres who were ripped off by less creative directors and companies for a quick buck. So, what changed? The quick and easy answer? The industry figured out franchises away from the shadow of the slashers, namely Blumhouse and New Line, and then later A24. Blumhouse created Paranormal Activity and Insidious, which 1. Got people into theaters, and 2. Made people realize that James Wan wasn't just the guy who did really fucked up dare videos.
I want to play a game.
New Line Cinema hired James Wan to direct The Conjuring, which set a standard for corporations making high-budget, visually aesthetic films, usually given to more indie directors, namely directors like Robert Eggers, Ari Aster, and Jordan Peele, who made art house horror films, which led to the rather patronizing term of elevated horror. The 2000s, for all their faults, primed the industry to invest in independent directors and ethos, while at the same time reinventing itself, ironically, by once again dipping back into the 70s, not towards the ultraviolence and exploitation of it, but rather the more family-driven gothic-like stories of The Exorcist, Amityville Horror, and The Haunting, and in doing so paved the way for an industry that treated its genre and its audience with more respect. For lack of any better narrative order, I'm going to be reviewing these films in the chronological order, which coincidentally is the order I watched them in. Five. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And magic.
Let's all go to the lobby.
How it ties in. This is the origin story of the demon nun Valak, who appears in The Conjuring 2. The Warrens help perform an exorcism on one of the main characters a few decades later. The Nun has the curious property of being both the highest grossing and lowest rating film in the franchise. We stan a queen with range. When I think about what I like about this film, it's mainly the aesthetic. This film has some great filming locations, some really fantastic set designs that play, albeit a little too heavily-handedly, into the Christian motifs of the series, and overall this film is very visually appealing. In terms of visuals, it really underlines the slick production value that makes these films pop. I also like that Corin Hardy wasn't afraid to add camp elements to this film, but it doesn't save it by any means. If you're going to give me schlocky nuns, then for the love of God, give me a little nunsploitation. The main issue, which isn't unique with the worst of films in the universe, is the plot and the pacing. This film is incredibly slow-paced, but unlike the Conjuring trilogy, which is more slow burn and procedural, this film is more accurately action horror. So we have the meshing of high-octane, demon nun action scenes with slower, more gothic-style tracking shots through the castle, and these don't really complement each other. The plot also throws in spoopy twists and scares, which work for things like the poltergeist. but drew me out of the film. There are other moments that utilize a more camp or exploitation style, but they're not frequent enough to really galvanize the tone. I honestly wish this film would pick a lane. On one hand, we have this very serious, very grim gothic story with some really visually satisfying moments, and then you have Taysa Flamingo spitting the blood of Christ into the demon nun's face. And I love both of these scenes, but they don't really congeal into a solid narrative. Hey Charlie, can we play? So, how does it tie in? Annabelle creation is exactly what it says on the tin. The origin stories of that creepy-ass doll. Valak makes a cameo appearance. Also, it turns out one of the girls from this movie is the cultist from the beginning of Annabelle. To start this review, I just wanted to point out some things I really liked about this movie that I couldn't quite tie into the rest of it. So, 1, disabled protagonist. Always going to shout that out. I can probably count on one hand how many physically disabled characters I've seen in horror movies, and according to Letterboxd, I've seen 216. Yeah. Number 2, this movie's attention to architectural details. The themes of the film are symbolically represented through the architecture and the interior design of the movie, and I just love that. I love when movies add little details into it, and I love that this film is a bit more gothic, so that really ties into the theming and the genre. This film has a lot of things that I do like about it. The characters, the set design, the gothic tone, which none of the other films ever really managed to capture, but my main issue for me is consistency. There are some really great scary moments, there are some really interesting visuals, but it never really ties into a cohesive narrative, and the third act is a hot mess. The lack of strength in the script department really drags down both the scares and the storyline, and that's really sad. This could have been a great modern gothic film like Crimson Peak or The Boy, but it just falls flat into an alright one. So, how does it tie in? John and Mia Form are attacked by members of the Disciples of the Rams and moved to an apartment building in Pasadena. This film also introduces Father Perez, a Catholic priest who resides over the parish. This film is heavily inspired by two things. First, Roman Polanski's seminal thriller Rosemary's Baby, and second, rather macabrely, the death of his wife Sharon Tate at the hands of the Manson family. On one hand, basing this film off of a contemporary horror movie and real-life tragedy seems to be pretty part and parcel for The Conjuring's ethos. On the other, this film is so badly made that it seems more disrespectful towards the real-life tragedy than anything else. There isn't a lot to like about this movie besides the costuming. The characters are flat and completely uninteresting, the plot is nonsensical, and besides 2 or 3 decent scares, this film is very, very, very slow. But it gets worse. One of the side characters, Evelyn, played by Alfre Woodard, falls pretty stereotypically into the magic Negro and mammy tropes. For the viewers in the back, the magical Negro is a black character who helps a white character normally by giving them some form of wisdom. This ties into the idea of the noble savage trope, where indigenous or non-white persons are seen to be more spiritual or in touch with nature. The mammy is a trope based on stereotypes of black women who are forced into nursing or governess positions by their white slave owners. Evelyn falls very hard into both of these tropes and roles in the film, taking on the domestic, specifically child-rearing duties of the Form household. A really great article I read by the Fright Queen further points out that Evelyn is not just a magical Negro, but a sacrificial one. The sacrificial Negro, to the best of my knowledge, was coined by Tananarive Due, a ULCA professor. To quote, "There's the sacrificial Negro, who exists only to save a white character," Due said. "There's the magical Negro trope, which sort of gives us supernatural abilities that are often used in service to warning the white characters or asking if they're okay. And then First to Die was around for a long time. It kind of became a joke. We can chuckle about it now, but frankly, if we don't address it and if we don't call out these tropes, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, they roll back around." Annabelle is easily the worst film in this series, and the less I spend on it, the better. It's slow, boring, bland, and most importantly, high-key problematic. The past, the present, the future, and the final outcome. The Hierophant, the High Priestess, the Lovers, and the Fool. So, how does it tie in? This film starts in 1968 with the Warrens getting the Annabelle doll, then jumping to 1971 when they deal with the Perron family. This sets up the events for The Conjuring 2 and Annabelle Comes Home. Houses. It's hard not to look at this film and compare it to The Poltergeist or The Exorcist, which also featured haunted houses with intense family dramas. But unlike those films, which led us from the perspective of the family, we're led by the perspective of the Warrens. The Warrens have their detractors, as with any other person who openly and vehemently believe in the supernatural. But unlike other paranormal investigators like Zach Baggins, there is a sense of authenticity to their belief. In researching this video, I came across this rather thorough article about the Warrens written by the New England Skeptical Society, and this quote stood out to me.
Also, they claim to have scientific evidence which does indeed prove the existence of ghosts, which sounds like a testable claim into which we can sink our investigative teeth. What we found was a very nice couple, some genuinely sincere people, but absolutely no compelling evidence.
And that stuck with me, because this movie was never meant to be a hard skeptic belief story, like The X-Files or The Exorcism of Emily Rose. It's a story from the Warrens, specifically Lorraine Warren's perspective, and the deviation from real-world details are those rose-colored glasses. I want to be really vague about the aspects I like about this film, because what makes The Conjuring special is the root of what makes the rest of the films equally unique. To sum up one is to sum up them all. But I will touch on this. The Conjuring, like the films I mentioned earlier, all set out to be a more emotionally driven story that centers around family and love, and it's that emotional backbone that makes these movies shine. It gives us characters we're invested in, and that investment makes the story meaningful. Also, not to ruin the mood or anything, but that exorcism scene is a masterclass in tension and cinematics, and I just had to shout that out. I love that scene. So, how does it tie in? Okay, this is where it gets a little weird. The Conjuring is set in 1968 and 1971. This film is set in 1969, so technically it exists inside of the first movie, if that makes sense. This follows the daughters of the Warrens, who was aged down for the series into a preteen. She was 23 in real life. I'ma just say it.
I don't care that you broke your elbow.
I like this movie. And just to prove my point that this film is really polarizing, here are some fun, pithy reviews from Letterboxd. Annabelle. More like Anna bullshit. I'm not seeing enough hate for this movie, and it's jarring. Actual, literal garbage. We're gonna be DVD, Blu-ray, and digital copy of this atrocity. I'm not kidding when I say that this might just be my least favorite horror movie I've ever seen in my pathetic little life. Annabelle? I think you mean Anna Balls. Got 'em.
What? How? Did anybody actually read the script before filming? Edit. Was there actually a script?
This garbage doesn't deserve a review.
I had to change my rating of Annabelle from half star to full star so I could rate this one lower.
This was like Goosebumps. And I hated it! Stupid premises, stupid girls, stupid jump scares. Annabelle franchise is cancelled.
I hope this bombs and ends the series.
Fuck you.
I feel at this point, I think it would be good to point out the difference between The Conjuring and the rest of the spin-offs. Thematically, the Conjuring trilogy is very similar, using an ethos and theming that ties into an overarching story of the Warrens. The rest of the films are, for lack of a better word, different. Annabelle is a moody drama that was adapted from somebody's helter-skelter fanfiction. Annabelle Creation is a traditional gothic story of some modern blockbuster scares, and The Nun is someone trying to make a serious nunsploitation film. What I'm trying to say is that The Conjuring is its own self-sufficient work, with its own stories and themes, and the spin-offs don't have to follow that. These films can be experiments and random little offshoots of the main series. And that doesn't necessarily make them bad, it just makes them different. To quote producer Peter Safran, The idea of Night at the Museum in the Artifact Room, it just felt great, Safran continued. And it's kind of been that the whole way through, just from the script development, storyboards, and prepping the movie. That every step of the way, we were like, this is a really interesting one, and it just feels different. Now, I don't want to minimize people's objections with the plot, and there are some very valid criticisms about the characters and other technical aspects of the film. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that this film is a very different tone than the others. It's more emotionally grounded in the drama between the main characters, and it takes place over a shorter period of time. It's more of a teen film, unlike the serious, brooding, adult Conjuring films, and if you're not prepared for that, then you might not be receptive for what it's trying to show you. For me, I absolutely love this film. It's probably one of my favorites of the series. It has all the good sweet spots of the Conjuring Verse, from the period costuming and the really well orchestrated and designed scare scenes, along with a lot more levity than we're used to, even with The Conjuring. One of the things that makes the original trilogy so impactful is its ability to combine the sort of light levity of family drama with these intense scares. And so this film is a little bit more lighter than expected, but it still has that wholesome backbone that gives tooth to this micro-genre, if you will. Also, I'm mildly obsessed with the sweater girl look, and Katie Sackhoff is serving it. Oh, love her. First question I would ask you is, point to where my city that I live in is. Go this way. Okay. So, how does it tie in? Father Perez is in this film. That's it. Apparently, Perez was like, let's move 10 miles and become the parish priest at a different church. And that is the only thing that is tying this dumpster fire to the Conjuring Verse. This movie was so bad that I kind of want to make a full roast review, so I'll keep this short. What we find scary and what we believe in is defined by our culture, which is one of the reasons why exorcist films are so popular in the West. Not because every American genuinely believes in demonic possession, but because the idea of it is ingrained into us from our society. In some sense, the idea of demonic possession is what's known as a culture-bound syndrome, kind of similar to the Wendigo psychosis. Whatever somatic effects the sufferer faces are colored by the cultural lens. That's not to diminish these beliefs, but to underline that similar phenomena will have different subjective interpretations. So, where does that leave La Llorona? The first issue for me with this film is the main lead is played by Linda Cardellini, who, despite her talent, is not Latina, either in real life or canonically within the film. And that's an issue. La Llorona, just like the idea of a demon or a Wendigo or an Obanji, is a culture bound. So when they attack people outside of the culture, what does that mean? How can La Llorona have power on Linda Cardellini if Linda Cardellini is not even aware she exists or has any belief in her prior to the film? La Llorona, simply put, is a watered-down interpretation of Mexican folklore and culture that strips all the nuance and meaning of its cultural context to yet another spoopy film about the boogeyman. It's also poorly written, and it feels a little racist, just saying. For me, this film is such a huge misstep, not because it wasn't a good high concept. I honestly want to watch a bunch of films about La Llorona because Mexican and Latin American folklore are really, really interesting. The reason why this was such a huge misstep was because it insults the people it's making a movie about. Roman Catholicism is the primary religion in Mexico, which means that just like how I was receptive to the Christian imagery, being raised Pentecostal, so is a large demographic of people who live outside of the Anglosphere. I would have loved a modern Gothic style film which dealt with these types of themes and ideas, but what we got was a curandero with La Llorona holy water. No wait, I'm sorry, let me check my notes. Anti-venom.
What is that?
The tears of La Llorona have sanctified them.
Why?
Anti-venom.
So, how does it tie in? Ed and Lorraine Warren finally meet Valak, the demon that's been in the background this entire time. Other than that, this film is self-contained. As I mentioned earlier, the Conjuring trilogy are very similar in terms of themes and ideas, and so it's really hard for me to distinguish each film without covering already treaded ground. That being said, there are some really enjoyable aspects of this film that make it stand out. We get more background on the Warrens, and they really develop the relationship between the two. I liked how there was a greater focus on skepticism in this movie because it really helped ground the Warrens as characters for me. And there were so many great scenes. So there's an interview scene where they have Ed Warren in the foreground, and then they use a split diopter or some other split focus shot to show the possessed girl who he's interviewing in a soft focus. And as the scene continues, her silhouette slowly morphs into the ghost that is possessing her, which I thought was really well done and also very visually and technically interesting from the sort of vintage retro theming of these movies. There's also this crucifix scene where she's in a room of crucifixes and they all turn upside down. And it's one of the few similar sort of tracking 360 shots you see in the franchise, but this one was equally iconic. There's also the astral projection scenes of Lorraine Warren that were done so well, and I thought really just made her such an interesting character in this movie. This movie has so many great visual moments that it really helped underline what I love about this franchise, and that is their great set pieces. People overlook setting so much in horror movies, and I hate it. There are so many boring movies of flat, uninteresting walls and settings and scenes, and every time I watch a Conjuring movie, I know that even if the plot or the pacing is not going to be good, it will always be visually interesting. People overlook setting so much in horror movies, and I fucking hate it. Some of my favorite movies like Candyman and The Green Room and The Taking of Deborah Logan are so memorable because they took the time to make really visually interesting scenes to film their movies in. The Conjuring has the same sort of idea where they want to put a lot of effort and a lot of money into making very visually interesting locations. And in The Conjuring 2, you have a lot of these similar scenes. You have the cellar, you have this crucifix room later on in the movie, and all of these moments are really iconic and really great because they're giving us a location which we wouldn't immediately associate with horror, and they're transforming it in a way that really changes our understanding of the space. What I'm saying is that a little aesthetic goes a long way, and this film manages to give us moment after iconic moment in terms of visual and technical direction. Also, I'm low-key obsessed with scary nuns.
As we gather, hearts are true, spirits near, we call to you. As friends we gather, hearts are true, spirits near, we call to you. Is anybody there? If yes, knock once, and if no, knock twice.
So, how does it tie in? Following the case of Arnie Johnson, we hear from the Disciples of the Ram again. This is the last film in the series, set in 1981. If you're a sharp-eared listener, you might remember the quote that I started this video with. The quote is talking about House of Leaves, a postmodern behemoth of a novel that I refuse to summarize in any shape or form because it's the homestuck of hipster books that I own. The main takeaway is that as you're reading, you notice the big main details. The labyrinth, the minotaur, the shotgun. But looking back, you realize how much of the story is actually devoted to discussing the relationship between the married couple. In the same way, the Conjuring trilogy, if all the Tumblr posts are to be believed, is about the relationship between Ed and Lorraine Warren. But don't take that from me. Here's a quote from Vera Farmiga, who plays Lorraine Warren.
I know what I find fascinating, and it's that they are the personification of love. It is a love story for me. It is more of a love story than it is a horror story to me, and that's what makes it so unique and successful. That's why I enjoy coming back. That message of love, and not only the Warrens for each other, but for the work that they do and for the people that they help. That selflessness, that compassion, that embodiment of love is really something holy and special that makes it digestible and beautiful. Vera Farmiga.
That's not to diminish the scares or the actual plot of the film, but what I like about the Conjuring trilogy is its sense of love of family, of some kind of familial bond that makes life worth living. And yes, that can be sappy and saccharine, but also provides a type of levity that makes the films it was inspired by so much more worth it. In terms of the movie itself from a technical perspective, I agree with the critics. I thought it was an interesting turn making the antagonist the fleshy sort, and the occultist is serving scoremom realness. But the spiritual attacks taking place just seem to lose that too for me. Another issue it has was all the references. The Exorcist shot, okay, I love a good homage, and clearly it is an influence for the series. Little late, but whatever. But then did we need the waterbed homage from Dream Master? Did we need the Psycho reference? We have the cadaver from the mortuary scene who looks weirdly like the pale lady from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. And sure, Chavez, I'll pretend like the cliff chase scene doesn't bear a weirdly strong resemblance to the balcony scene of Paprika. I like a reference as much as the next person, but too many references spoil the broth for me. I found this to be an enjoyable film, though I do think it was a step away from the formula set up in the first two. The first two movies are these gothic-like, slightly procedural family dramas, while this one felt more like a 2-hour 90s thriller. I thought it was a good film, but it definitely felt weaker both thematically and narratively than the first two in the series. Now that I've had some time to watch these films, it's given me time to think about a lot of the themes and context of these movies. I remember seeing this post once that discussed how nostalgia wasn't simply the desire to consume media from your childhood, but as a form of mental escapism from the confines of late-stage capitalism, where you had this freedom to do whatever you wanted, and the future seemed infinite. These movies are in some sense nostalgic. They're set in these beautiful period settings and invoke rather traditional values. The Warrens are devout religious sort who dress conservatively and interact mostly with patriarchal nuclear families. It very much ties into the older ideas of American values. In some ways, that's comforting. It's like hearing an old family story. But in other ways, like we see with Annabelle, it simply belies the prejudices and biases of the past. It's also important to recognize that Christianity, specifically Catholicism, is inundated within the story. This idea of this cultural belief is so ingrained into American society that the mythology of this religion is considered canon within the series. This ethnocentrism can be alienating both for the a-religious and for those that practice other faiths. I'm agnostic myself, but I also recognize that my religious upbringing influences how I view films which touch on religious themes. The Conjuring Verse has many strengths, from its high production and editing to its subtext and theming, and it's clear why it was such a prolific series. However, I do wonder where it will be going forward. The current meta in horror films is moving towards more art house and moody films. For instance, I would have never been able to see movies like Titan, Pig, and Lamb in my local theater 5 years ago. The Conjuring are by very definition blockbuster horror, and as blockbusters go, they're the creme de la creme. It's difficult to know if the Conjuring Verse will be able to fit into the landscape of elevated horror, or if the series, along with its contemporaries, will be met with the same type of skepticism going forward, just like how legacy slashers are met with skepticism today. If you've reached the end of the video, I just want to thank you and congratulate you on watching one of my first ever video essays. Please do all that good stuff that makes the algorithm happy, and tell me what horror stories you want me to review next. This is FalseBulls123, and as always, I'm signing out.